Do you feel there is any danger of thought control or political control in our schools if federal aid to education is increased?
The answer to this question is no. I am for federal aid to education. I am for federal aid to parochial schools. I am for federal aid to anybody who will do a sound educational job. It is unjust to deprive the people of one state of education simply because they live in a state that is poorer than another. We are either one country or we're not. And if we are one, we better see to it that everybody in it gets a decent education if we can, because we can't tell when he's going to be living next door to us. "50% of the families in America have moved within the last 5 years. Most of the state of Mississippi has moved in next door to where I used to live in Chicago. Most of the black part of the state of Mississippi has moved in there. And the northern states, the western states, think of where the population of Los Angeles has come from. And since we know that everybody in this country is on the move, we can't tell whose education or what state's education we're going to suffer from in our own community. Now the question of thought control. This is not a matter of the source of support. This is one of the great American illusions. It is that money automatically carries with it the control of an educational program. It is true that money may do that, but it is only true in countries that allow it to happen. The Minister of Education of the Netherlands was a friend of mine. He had under the law, I'm sure I've told you this story before, he had under the law the power of appointing all the professors in the universities in Holland. And I said, well, why don't you do it? I said, why don't you, well, appoint one, I said. Appoint one that the professors at the University of Leiden don't like. You appoint him. And see what happens. I said, what would happen? He said, my government would fall. In other words, the people of Holland are perfectly willing to have him have this authority as long as he doesn't use it. The people of Holland recognize that there may be an emergency, which they would see to be an emergency, and which it would be useful to him to have these powers. But as long as there is no emergency, as long as the universities are doing their job the way the people want them to do it, the faculties have complete control of the universities in Holland, in spite of the fact that all the money comes from the state. 75% of the money for Oxford and Cambridge comes from the public treasury. No Englishman supposes for a moment that any representative of the government can in any way affect the program, the course of study, or even the research program of those universities. The reason why we are used to this is that American education developed ad hoc. We set up education in America because somebody wanted to do something. The Puritans said, dreading to leave an illiterate ministry to the churches, when our present ministers shall lie in the dust, we've got to found Harvard. So they did. They founded schools in Massachusetts Bay because the Puritan ministers had to have congregations that could read. And so it has gone. The Morrill Acts of 1862, 30,000 acres of federal land for every seat to which any state was entitled in Congress, for the establishment of what? Institutions to study the practical arts and advance the practical conditions of our people. And half these institutions were incorporated in the state universities, thus introducing a type of curriculum hitherto unknown in the Western world. So you have a situation in this country in which education is always somebody doing something for somebody by way of the educational system. Therefore, the person who puts up the money to get this done is entitled to see that it's done. But this is a wholly erroneous conception of education. If education is seen as achieving its best results, if those who are dedicating their lives to it determine its policies, and if this is understood by the people, the fact that it is the government of the United States rather than the government of California that is controlling the educational system will be wholly immaterial. And as for me, I would rather trust the government of the United States than, let us say, the government of, let us say, Illinois any day in the week.
Wouldn't you say education attuned to our problems today is more important than the classics?
That's a very interesting question. Which would you say was more relevant to an understanding of the contemporary world? The words of Socrates or the words of Norman Vincent Peale? If you wanted to get a model for a presentation of an important subject today, which would you choose, Cicero or Warren G. Harding? And so, if the problem is, what about the relations between foreign states? Would you say that you would be more interested in Edmund Burke or in, let's say, John Foster Dulles? That is, the fact that a problem is current does not mean that the way to understand it is to attack it directly. For example, I do not think that the way to make a girl livable, lovable, and dateable is to give her a course in that subject. I think this is another great American illusion. Direct education, ad hoc education, education in how to do this, how to solve this, how to get there, is almost always a delusion.
What can parents do to improve the education in our schools?
One has to say at the end, one always has to say the same thing, because the question always is, what can you do? Well, what can you do? What can you do about anything? What can any individual do about anything? This is a bureaucratic culture. The sources of power are mysterious and remote. We don't even know how to find the people who are really making the decisions, and if we identified the office, we'd undoubtedly be told that the man who had made that decision was out of town. And this, of course, has been used with great advantage in defensive education. When the regents of the University of California received a protest from the American Legion about a question on the Subject A examination, which is taken by all entering freshmen, which seemed to reflect on Mr. Hoover and the FBI. The Board of Regents, of course, did the right thing by Mr. Hoover. It immediately wrote him a letter and apologized and said it would withdraw the examination and never allow this to happen again, and it would see to it that the people who were guilty of putting this question about the FBI on the examination were punished, but the only trouble was they couldn't find the people. When the question was, who framed this examination question, it was absolutely impossible to locate the person. In this case, you see, the bureaucracy worked on behalf of higher learning. Ordinarily, it works the other way. There isn't any way of breaking through the barriers with which people who have vested interests in certain operations protect themselves from public interference. And anybody who watched, as I did, the Los Angeles Board of Education during that heroic struggle which culminated in the prohibition of all references to UNESCO in the schools of this city will understand why it is difficult, why it often seems almost hopeless to try to fight against the forces that are preventing education from arising in this country. But this is itself an interesting example. Something did happen in Los Angeles. It took a little while, but they carried this business of anti-education in the educational system just a little too far. So I think that first, the only thing that it is possible to do in a democratic country on any subject is to keep talking and to take every opportunity to talk. I ran across today a letter from Jefferson to John Adams. Jefferson, at the age of 70, wrote to John Adams at the age of 78. And Jefferson says, I state my difference with you, not because I wish to begin a controversy, because we are both too old to change opinions arrived at over a long life of experience and reflection. I state my difference with you, therefore, only because I believe that we ought, before we die, to explain ourselves to one another. This, I think, is in a sentence the aim of a democratic society. It is not necessary that we should agree, but it is necessary that we should explain ourselves to one another. Ernest Barker puts it this way: the object of democracy is to engage all the people in the effective discussion of their public affairs. I grant that the next step is almost an act of faith. That is, one has to say, I have faith that if there is effective discussion on the part of all the people in their public affairs, that then their public affairs will improve. But this act of faith I am willing to make.
Take the whole idea of working your way through college. I worked 8 hours a day in a factory when I was in college. Wasn't supposed to learn anything in college anyway. I was supposed to have this great character-building experience of working my way through. I think I'm the first person in American history who ever said that working your way through college was an anti-educational program. That if you were going to college, the thing to do was to beg or borrow or steal the money and go to college and get an education while you were in college. When you consider that the Scots have for generations been clubbing together to send boys to the best public schools and the best universities with all their expenses paid because they understood the intellectual value of the educational experience, this seems a kind of fantastic result in this country. I think it is a lack of respect for the mind.
That was Robert Maynard Hutchins, former Chancellor of the University of Chicago, now President of the Fund for the Republic and the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions. Robert Hutchins continues to be one of the most controversial figures on the American scene. Although many of his revolutionary innovations in American education have come to be accepted and respected, the man and his ideas continue to stir up a storm. One radio commentator recently said of him that he presents still the image of an icily intellectual egghead. Another, who knows him better, speaks of his wit and charm. while those who know him best talk about his passion for and unwavering faith in the democratic idea. In this tribute to Robert Hutchins, Pacifica Radio is presenting excerpts from several of his public addresses that convey some of his ideas and something of the spirit of the man. First, an excerpt from Mr. Hutchins' farewell address to the students at the University of Chicago. The address was made in February 1951. Mr. Hutchins had spent 22 years as president and chancellor of the University of Chicago. These were his last words as an officer of the university.
One of the saddest aspects of my life is that I have not organized it so that I could know the students better. It would be outrageous presumption on my part to suppose that my presence here has anything to do with yours, or that my departure can make the slightest difference to you. I can't even claim that I have been what Mr. Justice Holmes said the common law was not, a brooding omnipresence in the sky. I have had little chance to brood. I cannot, by any extension of the word, have been said to be omnipresent, unless it means being present everywhere else. And I have spent more time in Wall Street than in the sky. Yet, though seldom nourished by the sight of you, and sometimes not even by the thought of you, I have perhaps some right to say farewell to you because you have been the inspiration of my life and have given it such meaning as it has had. Here I do not refer to you as individuals sitting here tonight, but to the hundreds of thousands of young people who have passed through these halls while I have presided over the university, and who have symbolized for me the rising generation and the hopes of mankind. If it had not been for you and what you stood for, I should never have had the impulse to carry on my modest and intermittent efforts in higher education. I hope that you will follow the example of your university, for I still think, as I have thought for many years, that the motto of the university should be that line from Walt Whitman, solitary, singing in the West, I strike up for a new world. Now our lives are overshadowed by the threat of impending doom. If you were neurotic, I could not blame you. To what extent the threat of impending doom grows out of our ignorance and immorality, and to what extent it grows out of the ignorance and immorality of the Russians, I do not pretend to know. I confess, too, that I have a lifelong hatred of war that perhaps makes it impossible for me to have a rational view of the present situation. War has always seemed to me the ultimate wickedness, the ultimate stupidity. And if this was true in less enlightened days, when the best we could do was to slaughter one another with TNT, it is plain as day now, when, thanks to the progress of the higher learning, we can wipe out thousands of innocent people at one blow and be wiped out ourselves in the same way. I am not a pacifist. I would echo the sentiments of Patrick Henry. I admit that when a great power is loose in the world, seeking whom it may destroy, it is necessary to prepare to defend our country against it. Yet the goal toward which all history tends is peace. Not peace through the medium of war, not peace through a process of universal intimidation, not peace through a program of mutual impoverishment, not peace by any means that leaves the world too frightened or too weak to go on fighting, but peace pure and simple, based on that will to peace that has animated the overwhelming majority of mankind through countless ages. This will to peace does not arise out of a cowardly desire to preserve one's life and property, but out of a conviction that the fullest development of the highest powers of men can be achieved only in a world at peace. War, particularly modern war, is a horrible disaster. If this is the destiny prepared for us, we must meet it as best we can. But at least we should have no illusions about it. There is a certain terrifying lightheartedness underlying the talk about war today. Each political party is belaboring the other, not because it is too warlike, but because it is too peaceful. Men in public life are being crucified because they are suspected of wanting to keep the peace. By endless reiteration of the slogan, "America must be strong," we have been able to put a stop to our mental processes altogether and to forget what strength is. We appear to believe that strength consists of masses of men and machines. I do not deny that they have their role. But surely the essential ingredients of strength are trained intelligence, love of country, the understanding of its ideals, and above all, a conviction of the justice of our cause. Since men of goodwill can regard war as conceivable only as a last resort, they must be convinced that all channels of negotiation have been kept open till the last moment, and that their own government has sought in good faith and without consideration of face or prestige to prevent the outbreak of war. Men of goodwill must be convinced that they are not fighting to maintain colonialism, feudalism, or any other form of entrenched injustice. And since it is obvious to the merest simpleton that war must come sooner or later to a world of anarchy, men of goodwill would hope that their own government would proclaim its desire to transform the United Nations from a loose association of independent states into an organization that could adopt and enforce world law.
Robert Hutchins' farewell address at the University of Chicago was no farewell to the problems of education. His crusade for proper education continues. Next, you will hear excerpts from a recent meeting of the Modern Forum in Los Angeles. Mr. Hutchins is answering questions from the audience.
If you travel around the Western world and try to find out what people are interested in, and then ask yourself whether people in the United States are interested in the same thing, you will, of course, find that in many countries, at many levels of the population, the people want the same things that you think all Americans want. And yet, there is a slight but very important difference that keeps cropping up all the time, particularly in Europe. There is a notion abroad, and I mean abroad in a literal sense, there is a notion in Europe, in Israel, that there is something important about the mind. There is a strain in the Jewish tradition that is, I think, something that has done a great deal for the United States, and that is the doctrine that learning is a form of worship. And if I were to try to locate the one overwhelming weakness in the American character, it is lack of respect for the mind. Now, there is no particular reason why we should have had respect for the mind as far as the practical operation of our lives is concerned. Why do people in Russia manifest a certain respect for the mind and the works of the mind that I think is sometimes lacking in the United States? Well, the way to get ahead in Russia is to show that you've got a good mind. In this country, we know very well that one of the greatest handicaps you can have all we have to do is to remember what happened to Mr. Stevenson. Mr. Stevenson made a criminal mistake in disclosing that he could speak English. And when it became known that he had gone to Princeton and law school, what immediately followed was that he was an intellectual, which was, of course, sufficient to condemn him. Now, it is a fact that Horatio Alger didn't need a mind. In 1776, Adam Smith said that the best investment a man could make in the colonies was to marry a widow with 4 children. There was so much work to do that anybody who had somebody that could do the work and whose wages he could take away from could get rich in no time. The aim of the whole industrial system is to reduce all operations down to the level at which they can be performed by a 12-year-old child, and demanding very little of his attention at that. In 1948, Dr. Ruby Joe Reeves, a psychologist of Connecticut College, speaking before the American Association on Mental Deficiency, showed that the average male moron makes $3.50 a week more than a normal male worker, and that the female moron always makes more than a normal female industrial worker. What is the advantage of not being a moron? When Herbert Bismarck was following his father into the secretary's office at the Vatican, and the secretary let the Princeman Bismarck in, but wouldn't let Herbert Bismarck in, Herbert Bismarck disgracefully pounded, jumped, hit, and pounded the door some more. And the secretary said, "What's the matter?" He said, "I am Count Herbert von Bismarck." And the papal secretary said, "That explains but does not justify your conduct." I have offered an explanation of the lack of American respect for the mind. I cannot justify it. And I do not believe that the explanation will stand up much longer. It seems to me imperative to develop the intellectual power of this country if we propose to cope with the problems that we see on every hand. I'll give you just one. It is estimated that over the next 10 years, 80,000 new jobs a week will be required, regardless of automation. If you take automation into account, the number of new jobs that are required to absorb the people replaced by automation reaches astronomical proportions. It is freely predicted that automation will get rid not merely of hand workers, but also of middle management. In Sears Roebuck, for example, there are 2,000 people called middle managers. It is estimated that in 1970, 50% of the boys graduating from high school will not be able to find work. Now, this is a new situation. Our founding fathers believed that the twin curses of mankind were indolence and the love of money. The way to overcome the first was to appeal to the second. But what is going to happen in a workless, wantless, diseaseless, and if we are to survive at all, a warless world. It is suggested that machines are going to do all the work and the machines can produce everything that we need. Already we consumed in 1959 8,000 kilograms of coal, or its equivalent per capita in this country, as compared to 8 in Ethiopia and something like 3,800 in Russia. And the energy gradient is steadily rising. Calculations have been made of the energy put forth by slaves in previous days. According to these calculations, every man, woman, and child in the United States now has 85 slaves. There is no question that if we operated our farms and our factories at full capacity, we could feed the world. Because we have learned that there is an inelasticity of demand for all kinds of goods and not merely for food at home. What are we going to do with our goods? What are we going to do with ourselves? Well, we're not going to find out by that simple method of pragmatic trial and error, which was satisfactory in the days when we were filling out the frontiers and building up the industrial system behind the walls afforded us by two oceans. The problem of world organization is central. And anybody who thinks that we are going to stumble into the right formulation of a world organization is simply out of his mind. Therefore, although one can explain the lack of respect for the mind in the United States, one cannot justify it, and the explanation will not long stand up. The great immediate task of the future in this country is the development of intellectual power.
The question is asked, what do you regard as an ideal education?
An ideal education is the one that develops intellectual power. I believe that the question of moral education is not a primary question for higher education, at least. I arrive at this conclusion by a process of elimination. The educational institutions are the only institutions that can develop intellectual power. The ideal education is not an ad hoc education. It is not an education directed to meeting immediate needs. It is not a specialized education or pre-professional education. It is not a utilitarian education. It is an education calculated to develop the mind. There may be many ways, all equally good, of developing the mind. I have old-fashioned prejudices in favor of the 3 R's, in favor of the liberal arts, in favor of trying to understand the greatest works that the human race has produced. I believe that these are the permanent necessities, the intellectual tools that are needed to understand the ideas. This does not exclude later specialization, later professional education, but it does. My aim is to insist that without the intellectual techniques needed to understand ideas, and without an acquaintance at least with the major ideas that have animated mankind since the dawn of history, no man may call himself educated.
What is your opinion concerning non-personal methods of teaching? For example, television in the classrooms.
I have two answers, a matter-of-fact one and a mystical one. The matter-of-fact answer is that if the best teachers reach the students will get a better education than if they had worse teachers, provided there is some personal contact between the teacher and the pupil. To suggest that there is something totally impersonal about non-personal methods like television is to say nothing at all. If you have a teacher talking to 50 students with no discussion, and no personal relations between the teacher and the student. There is no reason why that teacher shouldn't be the best teacher in the world and addressing the same pupils along with 5,000 others on television. I have passed through the classrooms at the University of Chicago and seen a teacher lecturing to 7 students. Well, if he's going to lecture, there's no reason why he shouldn't lecture to 7,000. This does not mean that any system of lecturing to 7,000 can be regarded as an adequate educational program. What we say then is that insofar as present teaching is non-personal, in the sense that the teacher is simply addressing a large group, there is no reason why that non-personal teaching should not be done by machinery and the group be as large as possible. The emphasis then comes to lie on the personal cooperative relationship between the teacher and smaller groups of students or with individuals. Now, the mystical answer is this. There is a serious question about the effect on any communications process of the introduction of technological means. Sir Richard Livingston used to say, the Greeks could not broadcast the Aeschylean trilogy, but they could write it. Now, we can broadcast it. Well, of course, we could broadcast it, except we can't get a sponsor for it. But let's suppose we got a sponsor for it. We could broadcast it. Does this mean that we can't write it? I think there is something here that I'm not quite sure of. Professor Neff of the University of Chicago, Professor Rupert Hall of Indiana University have both devoted their enormous historical scholarship to showing that there is a remorseless tendency on the part of technology to substitute quantity for quality. It is only on some such mystical ground as this that one can say that a properly organized educational program might still suffer through the introduction of these mechanical means. If we assume, as for example Clifton Fadiman does, that every appearance on radio is worse than a similar appearance on a public platform, and that an appearance on television is even worse because of the nature of the medium, then we would have to make a similar assumption about the use of such equipment in the educational program. But if we can devote ourselves to developing the highest quality, if there is not something, in other words, remorseless about this influence of technology on quality, and if we can devote ourselves to maintaining the highest quality in education, if we can insist that the personal relationship must be maintained and that impersonal means can only be used where the instruction is now impersonal, then I believe there may be great hope, as a matter of fact, in television and similar mechanical aids to education.